Okay, that's 31 minutes past. I'm going to kick off the webinar today. So firstly, I'd like to say thank you to everybody for attending our Octopus 101 Getting Started webinar. Just some basic housekeeping. A link, there's no need to record anything. A link will be emailed to you along with some resources at the end of today's session. I'm Derek Campbell. I'm a solution architect or continuous delivery architect at Octopus Deploy, and I will be monitoring our Slack. So if you do have some time, I would recommend getting along to octopus.com/Slack and sign up for our community Slack. We'll be posting questions and a Q&A at the end of the session today. And today's session will be mostly presented by Ryan Rousseau, who's also a continuous delivery architect at Octopus Deploy. Hi, Ryan. How are you today?
Hey, Derek. I'm great. I am almost done with my morning coffee, so I am doing just fine.
Excellent, excellent. Well,
how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm not going to lie. It's gone 4:30, but I'm still drinking coffee, so I'm not sure how well I'll sleep this evening. But apart from that, I'm good.
All right, good. All right, thanks for that intro, Derek, and thanks for everybody for joining in to this introductory Octopus webinar. So what's on the agenda today? We're going to take an existing sample application and we're going to configure Octopus Deploy to deploy that to a variety of environments, dev to production, all during the webinar. Now, we're not going to cover advanced topics. This is an introductory webinar, so we won't touch on any advanced topics, and we won't really be touching on any external tools outside of Octopus. So we won't be looking at build servers today or any like testing servers. And that is a good point. So I imagine a lot of you probably know a little bit about Octopus, but just a brief overview. It is an automated deployment tool. We handle deployments. We don't handle builds or source control or anything like that. So you're not likely to see that today, but you will see a fully automated deployment pipeline. So even though we're not covering any advanced topics, we are going to cover a lot of ground. So we're going to talk about setting up your infrastructure, that is your environments and your deployment targets. We're going to talk about how to configure Octopus to be aware of your applications and how to deploy them. And that's going to cover packages, projects, configuration variables, the actual deployment process. And then we're going to tie it all up together with how to create a release and how to deploy that release to your infrastructure. And as Derek mentioned, we're going to do a Q&A at the end. So I imagine we've got a few other Octopods in the webinar Slack channel. So go on there. If you have any questions throughout the demo, ask them there. You'll probably get an answer. And Derek is going to gather up some questions to answer live at the end. All right, so that's the agenda. Let's jump into it. Enough slides for now. I'm going to show quickly the sample application we're deploying. It's called OctoFX, Octo Foreign Exchange. It's a ASP.NET based website that shows foreign exchange rates. It is running in IIS and it has a SQL Server database backing it. And there's also a Windows service that updates the rates on a continuous basis. So it's a good sample application. It hits a couple different .NET technologies, Windows Service, ASP.NET website, SQL Server. And we have this source code is open in GitHub. We have an Octopus samples repo that has a variety of samples. This is our ASP.NET sample. There's a .NET Core and Node, etc. So if you're looking for samples to get started with, maybe you want a sample application just to get up and running to see how it works without adding your application in, feel free to check out our Octopus samples repo, which we'll include in the resources. And that's something that you can take a look at later. All right, let's move on to the star of the demo. We're going to jump into Octopus Deploy itself. Now I'm looking at a mostly blank server, and we're looking at the dashboard, which is blank. But what you can see is in the middle of the screen, we have our very friendly onboarding guide. So it's going to guide us through the entire demo. It's going to take us from setting everything up to deploying our release. So let's start with step number one and tell Octopus about our infrastructure. So we're going to create our first environment. And in Octopus, what an environment is a grouping, it's a named group of what you're deploying to, your physical or virtual machines, your cloud resources, your Kubernetes clusters, whatever that infrastructure is, the environment groups that together. So I can think back to one of my previous jobs where we had all kinds of environments. We had development environments, QA, UAT, production, disaster recovery, and Octopus is really configurable in this way. You can add as few environments or as many as you need. You could have one if we're going to deploy directly to production. You can have 5 where you're going from like dev to test to pre-prod to disaster recovery. So it's very configurable. You can make it match your process. And for today, I'm going to use my favorite 3 environments, which is development, test, and production. And if that's what you're using, we have these nice links here. You can click on development, it populates it for you, save me some typing. I don't have to mistype during my demo too much. And I saved it. And you can see we have an environment now. It's named development. There's some other settings we can set, but the defaults are perfectly fine for this demo. So let's go back to environments. And before we add any of our infrastructure, let's just go ahead and add those other 2 environments. So we save that one, and let's go back, and we will add our 3rd and final environment, which is production. All right, so we've got our 3 environments. They're currently empty. You can see 0 targets in each of them. And the onboarding guide is going to guide us to create our first deployment target. And I've kind of mentioned this already, but that's what your deployment targets are: your servers, your physical virtual machines, cloud services, et cetera, Azure web apps or Lambda functions, all of that. That's what you're deploying to. So we're going to go in and add our first deployment target. And when you're adding your first deployment target, you get this category list of where are you deploying to? Are you deploying to Windows, which we are, so we will choose that. But if you're deploying to Azure or Kubernetes, you can also choose those. But for today, we'll choose Windows. And you see it gives you, okay, well, how are you deploying to Windows? And there's a few options for Windows. Azure, there's a VM extension for Azure that you can use, but we're not quite using that today. We're just going to stick with the Tentacle option. So in Octopus, the Tentacle is a Windows service that runs on your target machine that communicates with a server. It accepts work from the server to do your deployments, variety of tasks, health checks, etc. So we have 2 types of tentacles. There's a listening tentacle and a polling tentacle, and really the difference between those is the communication path. A listening tentacle sits passively and waits for the Octopus server to contact it with work to do. Whereas the polling tentacle will actively poll the Octopus server and ask, like, hey, do you have a job for me to do yet? Do you have a job for me to do yet? And continues to ask until there is work to do, in which case it goes and does that work and then continues the polling. So we're going to set up, now you would choose one of those based on your network configuration and how your firewall is set up and what you're allowed, like which direction you're allowed to push that information. And we have this nice link built into the page that can take you to the communication modes, and it goes over all those caveats with you and gives you a lot of good information for choosing which one you need. If you still have questions on whether you need a listening tentacle or a polling tentacle, feel free to reach out to support@octopus.com and we can talk with you and help you make the right decision. But for today, we're doing a listening tentacle. So when we go to add that listening tentacle, it's going to give us some installation instructions because we do have to install this on a server. It's going to give us a nice button to download the tentacle. And then the next option is, or the next piece of information is a thumbprint with some characters and a handy copy to clipboard button. This is the thumbprint of the server certificate. So the communication between the Octopus server and the Octopus tentacles is encrypted using the certificates. The Octopus server has a certificate and the tentacle has a certificate, and they use that to encrypt their communication. The other thing the thumbprint is used for is the tentacle and the server will actually only accept requests if it has a thumbprint that it recognizes. So if some random request comes into your tentacle and it doesn't have a valid certificate thumbprint that it trusts, it will just ignore that. It'll actually log it somewhere saying, hey, somebody sent a request with this thumbprint that I don't recognize. I'm not going to act on it. So we've copied that. And before I can go in and add this tentacle, I actually need to install it. So I have my dev server running. I've already installed I run the installer, so we just need to configure the tentacle. So we're going to go in, we choose the communication style, listening is what we're going to use. The storage settings, the defaults are fine. You can change where it stores the logs and the configuration, but for me, the default is usually good. You can change the default port, but by default, Octopus will use 10933 for listening tentacles. Automatically add us a firewall exception. That's handy for me. And then I add that Octopus thumbprint. So I'm telling this tentacle, this is the server you trust. And that's it. I click install. It's going to run an install script. It shouldn't take too long to run, but when it's done, I'll have a tentacle that has been installed and configured and is ready to accept request from my server. So you see it's running, we get some information about it, and we also get the thumbprint of the tentacle. So this is the tentacle certificate thumbprint. I can copy that and take it back to the server if I needed to, and it's handy to get it just in case you're not able to use the automatic discovery, which I will show here. Normally, you have the option to enter all the details, including that thumbprint manually, but because it trusts our server, the Octopus server can actually reach out and ask for those details. So it's going to reach out with that thumbprint that the tentacle trusts. And if we scroll down to this next page, you see it's filled in that thumbprint and other information automatically. So I didn't have to copy and paste it in. But if for some reason you've got some network access issues or you're not able to connect at the time, you can just copy that thumbprint from the tentacle and enter it manually. All right, let's finish setting up this target. We're going to give it a name. So this is going to be my OctoFX dev. It's going to be my web and app server. And really the name is what's going to be the most useful to you, the easiest way to identify it. A lot of people for the display name, they still use the machine name because that's an easy way to identify it. You can use whatever works for you, whether it's a descriptive sentence like this is my web and app server, or this is just machine 001. Whatever makes the most sense for your team. At the next point, I'm going to tell Octopus which environment does this machine belong to, and it's going to populate with the ones we've created. This is my dev server, so it's going into the development environment. And the next piece of information we need to give it to kind of give Octopus more information about how to treat this target, but also give us more visual information on what this is when we're looking at it through the UI is target roles. And these are kind of tags that you can apply information to your deployment target. It not only tells Octopus, like I want to deploy, how to deploy or what to deploy to this target, but it gives you some information. So you could say this is a web server and this is not a database server, I'm getting ahead of myself, it's an app server. You can be this generic, and if you're on a small team, you only have one project, it's probably not a bad approach. But as you grow, as you add more projects in, I find these generic names tend to lead to some growing pains. So even when I'm starting out, I like to be very specific with my target roles. So I usually put the product name in, OctoFX dash, and at this point I could say web because it's my OctoFX web server, but I even like to be more specific than that. I like to name the website in case in the future I have multiple websites. So this is going to be my trading site. Similarly, it's an app server, and I don't want to use my web tag for deploying my app server. So I want to use OctoFX it's the exchange rate service. So I'll call that the rate service. Now I could just call that service, but if I ever have multiple services, I don't necessarily know which one's running on there. It could be all of them, but there could come the time where I want to split those out across different machines. So I like to be very, very specific with these tags as early as possible. And that's pretty much it for the target. Like I said, we pulled all the other information in automatically through the discovery. I set the environment, I set the target roles. Let's save this. And now that we've saved it, we can go back to our deployment targets, see that it's listed in this grid by name, its URL and port number, but I can also easily see what environment it's in and what have I tagged it with. So I can easily see this and say, oh, that machine is running my trading site and it's running my rate service. I want to add one more target manually. Now it's already installed, so we don't have to watch the installer run again, but this is going to be a database machine. It's actually not running a database, but it's going to be what we call a jump box. I'm sure several people call it a jump box, but that's the pattern. That's the name for the pattern we've decided to use. So this is going to be my OctoFX database jump box. And what this is, it's not actually running on the database server itself. It's a machine that has network connectivity to my database that has permission to run the database scripts. So I'm not running scripts directly on my database server. I'm not running them from my web server, which could lead to potential issues, especially if you have multiple web servers in an environment. How do you know which one to run on? So a jump box is a good pattern for that. So you have one machine responsible for database scripts. Now there's other patterns to doing that. This is just one, but this is the one we're using for the demo today. And I want to add this manually because I wanted to illustrate that you can add a target to multiple environments. So this one machine, this one target is going to do the database deployments for all three of our environments. Now, in a real scenario, you may have network segmentation between dev and test and production. Those could be on separate networks. So you may end up with one database machine that deploys to dev and test, and it's another one that deploys to production. No problem. You would just have two jump boxes, one that's in two environments, one that's in a single environment. But today we get to use one for all three. So good bonus there. And we're going to get a role. And you see the ones that I've previously added come in, but I'm adding a new one. I just want this to be my database server. So database role. So kind of more generic one, but I don't have multiple databases. Octopus database seems to map pretty nice. So I'm going to use that. And I'm going to save. We can go back to the deployment targets and see that. So we see that it's been added. It's marked healthy because it's already been installed and had everything updated. And if we go to the infrastructure overview, we get a nice overview of all of our infrastructure. So we can see each environment, how many targets it has, and also how many total targets we have by type. We have two listening tentacles, also by status. Now, for a full demo, I'd like to have more than just a database in test and production. So I'm going to kick off a script in the background that's going to register some more targets for me automatically. So in saying that, I should mention anything you can do in the UI through Octopus has an API endpoint backing it. So there's a lot of flexibility with not only automating your deployments, but automating a lot of the ways that you use Octopus. So that should be done now. So if I refresh, so these are existing tentacles that exist on other virtual machines. I just ran a script that's going to register them for me automatically, so you didn't have to watch me go through and choose each environment and role. But now, and you can see test has a few more targets, production has a few more targets. We have 7 total. If I go into environments, we can actually look at these and see what they look like. So test environment has our database jump box that we added manually. It also has a app server and a web server. So that differs from development. Development, the app server and the web server are one machine, and test, it's 2 machines. And it differs in production even more. We have one app server, but we have multiple web servers. So you can have more than one target in an environment that has the same role. These are both going to run the trading site. So you can imagine these being behind a load balancer and both working as a web cluster. So that is our infrastructure in a nutshell. We added a few manually. We automatically added some. We've got 3 environments: development, test, and production, that are ready to be used to do deployments. So what is next on path? All right, we need to package up and upload our software. So I've got some packages pre-made, but we're going to go to the built-in package repository. So what a package is an archive file that contains your application, whether that's your website, your database scripts, your Node application, your jar file, that's your Java application. It's an archive of some type that has your assets. We have the ability to use an external feed. So if you already have something like an internal NuGet repository, you're using Artifactory or another external repository, you can pull that in. But you can also push directly to Octopus. Today I'm going to upload a package directly, but you can also push from a build server, a CI server. And that's the usual way that you would do it. You would have your build server build your application, create the package, and then push to Octopus. Now, if you have questions about how do I package my software, there are some categories buttons at the bottom here. So you can see if you're doing Java or Node, or in our case today, ASP.NET. It's got some instructions for how to manually create a package, or how to set up your build server to create the package for you. So a lot of good options there. So if you have questions about that, it's a good resource to look at and see how to create your packages. Now I've already got mine created, so I'm going to click upload. And I'm going to choose, we've got 3. We have one for database, one for the Windows service, and one for the website. So I'm going to upload the database package. And while that's uploading, I'm going to pull up the NuGet Package Explorer and just show the contents of what this package is. So it's a executable, octofx.database.exe, which is using an open source library called dbopt to run some database migration scripts. So we have to tell Octopus how to run this in some way. And the way it's done in this particular case is through deploy.ps1, which has a single line, which is calling the executable. So by convention, Octopus can look into your package when it deploys it and extracts it. It will look for deploy.ps1 and run it for you. You can also put it in line in your deployment steps, which I'll show in a little bit, but that is how this deployment step works. It's going to use this deploy.ps1 file. And the background, I can see it uploaded correctly. We've got the ID, we've got the version number, some other information about it. If I go to upload another package, I'll just go ahead and do the Windows service. And while that's uploading, we can show the contents of that service. It's very similar. It is the root of what I want to be in that's running for that service. It's the service executable, its config file, and its dependencies. So not a whole lot in this. And there's not a separate deploy script because Octopus can handle Windows services automatically for us. All right, one more package. We're going to upload our website. And while that is uploading, we'll show that package, and you can probably guess by now what's going to be in the package. It's just going to be the root of our web directory. So you see we've got our bin folder, content, views, etc., as well as our web config and some transforms. And those are going to be important to talk about in a little bit. So that is what the packages look like. That's how you can get them into Octopus, especially when you're just starting out with like a proof of concept and you don't necessarily have all the integrations to your build server figured out yet. You can upload the package directly. So I've uploaded all 3 of them. We can see them in the table. We've got our database, our service, and our website, and the highest version that has been uploaded. Of course, there's only one version of each, so it just happens to be the highest. All right, so we've got our application. What is next? All right, we're going to create our project. Our project is kind of like a blueprint for how to get your application to your infrastructure. It's going to take those packages, it's going to have some deployment steps and some configuration variables. It's going to put that all together and use that as instructions on taking your applications and moving them through those environments. Let's add a project, give it a name of OctoFX, save that off. Now, before I define my process, I want to go in and talk about configuration variables and set some variables. So configuration variables can be used, or project variables can be used in a few different places, actually quite a few different places. You can use them in your steps when you're configuring them to have different step values used in different environments or different situations. You can also use them to configure your application. So Octopus can, at deploy time, if you're, in our case, we're doing ASP.NET, it also works for JSON files, and you can configure other file types. But for web config and app config files, it will look at your connection strings and your app settings and look for names or keys that match variable names, and you can inject those automatically. So you can have Octopus update like your connection string or some app setting for you automatically. So I want to set up my database information. I'm going to do that by adding a few variables. I'm going to add octofx.server. Nope, I did it backwards. .database.server. And then I'm going to go find my value for this because it's database up in Azure. I'm going to get the whole thing. There we go. So you can see I've got a name of a variable, and this is, you can name them how you like. I like this format, and our team kind of likes the same thing, where it is the project name, then separated by a dot, the grouping, like what does this variable apply to? This is a database variable. And then lastly, the actual variable name. So this is the database server name. So octofx.database.server. You don't have to follow that convention, but as we'll see in a second, the built-in variables that Octopus provides also, it does follow this convention. So it's a nice one to follow because it makes everything kind of look consistent. And also just kind of helps, like I know what this variable is for immediately by looking at it. All right, let me add. So I'm gonna add that to the list. Let me add another variable. I think we need a database user. That seems like something we need. Octo admin. And I'm just going to add that to the list. Nothing special there. Let's do octofx.database.name. All right, this one's going to be a little bit different. I wanted the database name to be octofx dev, but only when I'm deploying to the development environment. I don't want, that doesn't make sense for production. I don't want my production database to be named dev. That could be confusing and lead to horrible things down the line. So if I only want it to be used in the development environment, we can use what we have here called scopes. And you can actually scope this value to a few different things. You can scope it to a specific target, to a specific role, or a step within your process. But I think the most common option you choose would be the environment. So I can say, if I'm deploying to development, use this value. And instead of adding it to the list immediately and then adding another value or adding another variable, I want to add another value. So I'm going to do octofx_test. And same thing, I'm going to change the scoping. And I say I only want this value if I'm deploying to the test environment. One more value. We're going to do octofx_prod, and this is going to be scoped to the production. I can add that to the list. Now I have a value, I have a variable that has a different value depending on where I'm deploying it to. It's like very, very handy, especially when you have settings that change in your config files that are different, database connection string being one of those. So I think I need one more thing for my connection string, and that's going to be the password, right? I got a user, got to have a password. Now, one thing you don't want to do is just type your password into plain text, into a variable. We have the option to change the type from text to sensitive, and this will make it a password or a sensitive variable. It will give it a password field. You can enter a password in, it'll be masked. Once we add it to the list and save it, you won't be able to see the value anymore. Octopus is going to encrypt it, store it encrypted in the database. It'll decrypt it during deploy time to use it, but you won't be able to read the value again. You can change the value, but you won't be able to read it again. And I need a full connection string to tie all these together. The sensitive variables, that's also not just for passwords, but good for anything that you don't want to be in your config that you want to keep safe. So like API keys is another good use case for those. Anything that you would want to mark sensitive to that you wouldn't want people to be able to generally see in public. All right. So I mentioned before, we can swap out configuration settings if the name matches the variable name. So I have in my app config and my web config, my connection string is octofx database. So no dots, it's not following my dot pattern. That's because this is what it is in my configuration file. So I've got octofx database, and I'm going to give it a full value of a connection string. And that's kind of hard to read. So let's open the editor and we can kind of scroll through. Now, what you may notice just jumping out immediately is I've got the server, and then immediately after the server, I've got a hash with some curly braces and another variable name, that octofx database server that we set up previously. This is the variable substitution syntax within Octopus. So you can actually inject other variables values into other variables, compose a variable from other values. And that's nice because if we scroll down the line, you see database.name is in there. That means when we're deploying to development, it's going to use the dev name. When we're deploying to production, it's going to use the production name, but I only have to have one connection string. If we go further down, you'll see the user is injected and also the password. So that's really nice because I had to mark the password as sensitive. If I put the password directly in the connection string, I would have to mark the whole connection string as sensitive, and that would not be a great experience. I can also have different passwords per environment, which is more likely, also different usernames. But I didn't have to set up 3 different connection strings. I could set up 1 connection string and just set up the smaller pieces that compose it. So that's a great feature to use, that variable substitution within other variables. Now I've got one more variable to set up before we jump into setting up our process, and this is going to be a trading site variable, and this is going to be the name. And I just want to set this up to show off some of the built-in variables. So we have a number of built-in variables that you can use during the deployment. A lot of them, or one of them, is based on the environment. So I can actually take the environment name and put it into this value. So at deploy time, this will be octofx-development, octofx-test, or octofx-production. So that's one of the many built-in ones. So I'm just going to show that off, save that. Okay, so a small set of variables. We set up our database connection string, we set up something for our website, and you can have, like I said, you can have many, many variables, as many as you need, but for today, this is going to be enough for our project. Our next step is to define our deployment process. So this is a series of steps where we start connecting a lot of these pieces. We're going to go in and add a step to deploy a package. Actually we're going to add 3 steps that all deploy a package, those packages that we uploaded earlier. Now you can see there are other categories. So if you're deploying to Kubernetes, if you're using Terraform, those categories are there for you to explore. Once you select a category, it's going to give you all the steps that match that category. So we're going to stick to the first 3 here. We're going to deploy a website.is. We're going to deploy a Windows service. But first, we're going to deploy our database, which is a generic deploy a package step, which is really the building block that most of those steps are built on. So we're going to give it a name, deploy database. And yep, we want to leave it enabled. It's going to run, package steps have to run on deployment targets. So we can tell it, now we tell it how and where to run. So we choose the role. We want this to run on our database roles. So this is connecting our project to our infrastructure. When I deploy to development, it's going to run this step on any target with the database role. And then we say, what do you want to run? What package do you want to deploy? I want to run and deploy my database package. And then there's some default options. You can, like I mentioned, by default, we have the variable substitution and config transforms turned on. You can turn those off. You can modify those. The transforms, I don't think I've went in detail yet, but we can do that now. So also by default, Octopus will run your config transforms for you. So if you have an app setting, an app.config or a web.config, if you have a web.release.config, that will automatically run on every deployment. And if you have web.environmentname.config, so web.development.config, web.test.config, those transforms will run at deploy time if the name matches that environment, which is really great because that means you can put all kinds of different things into your configuration transforms, other variable transformations, remove like your debug settings in your release one, and Octopus will handle that at deploy time for you. You can also add in some other features. One in particular, and a lot of them have to do with the steps that are coming up, but the one I wanted to just talk about briefly is these custom deploy scripts. And this is what I mentioned looking at the database package. There's actually 3 custom deploy scripts. There's pre-deployment, deployment, and post-deployment. So you can put this inline, that PowerShell to run the database executable. You could put that inline in your step as a deployment script, but we already have it in our package as deploy.ps1. So Octopus is going to run that for us. There's no need for us to put it inline here, but you can do it either way. So it's very flexible. You can choose which way is right for you. You can start out by putting it inline and then maybe move it to a file in source control later. We also support more than just PowerShell. You can use C#, Bash if you're going to Linux, and also F# and Python. So you don't have to stick to PowerShell. You can use another language to do your deployment scripts. So let me turn those off because I don't need those. And other than that, the defaults are going to work for us. So we're going to save this off. and go back to our process, and we'll see that we have one step, deploy database. It's going to tell us the package it's taking, and it's going to tell us that it's running on roles of octofx.database, exactly what we want. So let's take one more. Well, two more, but one more first. We're going to deploy a Windows service. Same thing, we're going to call this deploy rate service. And steps are going to be very similar. We're going to set up the role. We want it to run on the rate service role. We want it to run our service package. And this one has a few extra options. We can set up the Windows service. So we can set up the service name, which I think I want to be OctoFX rate service, something simple. Display name, I want something similar. And I didn't set up a variable for this, but you can also inline, we have insert a variable as an option. So you can see variables that we've already created as part of our project are at the top. Or you can scroll through and see we have a lot of built-in variables. So you probably want to search for the one you're looking for. Environment.name. So OctoFX rate service dash environment name will be the display name. As for the executable path, let's remember it's octofx.rateservice.exe. I don't need any arguments passed to it. I can change the startup information and configuration, but the defaults are fine, so I'm not going to change any of this. And I do want it to run the configuration variables and transforms, so I am good to save this step. So that step, it will extract our package, and then Octopus will configure the Windows service for us based on those values we put in. So one last step, and it's going to be deploy to IIS. It's going to look very similar in the beginning. So we're going to say this is deploy trading site. We're going to choose our trading site role, choose our trading site package, and then we, instead of Windows service options, we have IIS options. So for my case, I want it to run as a website. You can change it to a virtual directory or web application. I want to give it a website name. In this case, we created a variable for that, so I can just inject that there, copy that. So because the root of my package is the website, then the physical path option is the same. If you have it in a subdirectory, you can use a relative path. I do want it to start the website for us. And the application pool information, I just want to use the same name. Defaults look fine to me. You can set your bindings. By default, it's going to bind to port 80, but you can add SSL and certificates or different ports to your bindings. I'm going to leave the defaults. The one thing I will change is changing from Windows authentication to anonymous. That always bites me. Sometimes I forget that, so good thing I didn't this time. And then our default configuration variables and transforms, we want those to run. We want that connection string variable to be replaced in our application so that it works. And that should work. So we're going to save it. If we go back and look at our process, we see that we've got 3 steps now: deploy a database, deploy a rate service, and the trading site gives us all the information we need. Now, next step, we're going to create our release. So let's go in and create the release. When we create a release, it's going to take a snapshot of that process and those variables at the time when we create it. So if you come in and do a deployment all the way up through test, and a week later you change the process, it's not going to affect that production deployment. It's going to use the process that was in place when you created it. So we have a version name that is auto-calculated. You can change how it's calculated. We have 3 packages selected. If you had more than 1 package for each, you could choose which version you want. By default, it will pick the latest. But let's save that and kick off. And on the release screen, you can see the life cycle. So it's going to go dev, test, and production in order. You can change that through a configuration. By default, it's going to go in the order the environments were added, which you can reorder on the infrastructure screen if they're not in the correct order. Shows us some package information and some history at the bottom that will fill up as we do this demo. So let's deploy to the development environment. Before we deploy, show that I do have the website here and it can't be reached, it's not running. So hopefully after this deployment, it does run. So there are some settings we're going to deploy to development. We can change when it runs and if we exclude any steps, but we want it to run now and we want it to run everything. So we are going to click deploy. And this is going to take us to the deployment task screen. We're going to see the status. Right now it's acquiring packages. It is downloading those 3 packages and pushing them to the machines in our environment that we're deploying to. As it steps through these, we'll be able to go in and see information, some tasks that are task information that is being logged. On the right side, you can see the history of this deployment. You can see that I queued it, and then it was picked up because there's nothing else running. It was picked up and immediately started. So if we click into this deploy database, you can see that we've got this tiered log information, so you can actually see the name of the server it's running on. And then you can see that, oh man, it's already finished. We made it, guys. We did our first deployment. So we made it. Let's close that for now so we can finish talking about it. That always surprises me when it pops up. I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot that that's there, but it's always a good feeling. It worked. It succeeded. No failed demo today. So you can see that it goes through and it's actually running our environments, our migration scripts. And then we can click into the other 2 and you can see that it's running on our web and app server, that it's going through and configuring the Windows service. It's going through and configuring IIS. If you need more information, you can change the log level and how many messages are seen, or you can download the raw log directly, which will be the full task log in text format. But for now, let's promote this to test. And same default options, deploy everything, deploy it now. And while that's running, let's refresh this site and see if it's working. Cross our fingers. Well, yeah, okay, so it's running. So our deployment succeeded, our database is running, our service is running, and our website's running. So everything's looking good. Let's go back and check on test. It's still, there we go, it's updated. So this will be good because now we can see, okay, it's run on the database, it's running on the app server, and it's running on the web server. So you can see it's actually taking that service and that website going to 2 different machines. If I deploy to production, same thing. I want to deploy to everything. I want to deploy it now. It's going to run through and we should see something different around the website step. While this is running, I'm going to jump back to the release overview because now you can see some more information. You can see its progress through the life cycle. You can see this currently deploying to production. You can see the full deployment history at the bottom along with who did it. So you see my gravatar there. And we can actually jump back to the overview of the project. So if you have multiple releases for this project, you would see a trail of releases along with where they're at in the process. Same with the dashboard. The dashboard will give you even higher level of information. If you have more than one project, you'd have a grid of projects and which version is at which environment and what's its status. So it's finished. So I do want to go in and just quickly show. So we did deploy to the database, everything went fine. Deploy to the app server for the service, makes sense. And we deployed to 2 web servers. This is because we had those 2 targets in that environment that both had the trading site role. So Octopus will deploy to both of those at the same time. You can also configure it to go 1 at a time or 2 at a time, but for today's demo, we did 1. So one or all at the same time. So we deployed to 2 web servers at the same time. So we've done our deployment, and that is the demo. We've built an application. Well, we took an existing application, but we built the configuration in Octopus from scratch. We set up our infrastructure, our targets, our project, and we deployed from development to production all in one go. All right, Derek, I am winded. Do we have questions?
Ryan, that was fantastic. That was really well put together. We've got a couple of questions. The first one that I had is from Alex. Is there a list of what CI tools does Octopus integrate quite well with?
Oh, that's a good question. So what CI servers or CI tools do we integrate well with? I don't know any that I could say we don't integrate well with. Because everything is API based, it's very easy to make a request to Octopus to push something or to create a release. We have plugins for a variety of servers. So there's a Jenkins plugin, there's a TeamCity plugin, Azure DevOps or TFS extension exists. But yeah, it's like really, it's very easy to integrate with any of those. And then those plugins just make it even easier.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much. Got another question here about could you show how to create a step template? It's a little bit more advanced, but
I can, yeah. So step templates are a little bit more advanced, kind of outside the introduction realm, but that is a good point. What happens if there is you want to do something that's not built into Octopus? Well, I talked about how the deploy a package step is generic, but what if you want to reuse something over and over, or the run a script step is generic, you want to reuse that over and over? Under the library, there is a option under step templates, and you can create a custom one. We also have a community library where a bunch of really smart people have already written some templates and shared them with everybody, and you can import those very easily. But if you wanted to create your own, you could come in and set up a name. So this could be my deploy OctoFX database package or step. You can give it some parameters if you wanted to set up certain parameters, like maybe a port number or a name. That would just be simply setting up like a port. The label is going to be port. It's actually not a great variable name, but for time constraints, you can set it up, and we can give it a default value of 80. Add that, and then you would set up the step like you would normally set up a step in your process. So I want this to be my database package. You can also bind this to a variable. That's more advanced, but we do have a video, I think a blog post on that. So that's something we could share with people in the Slack channel who are interested. And then you just set the settings that you want to run every time. And once we save that, we have a custom step called deploy OctoFX database. If we went back to our project, we could replace, or even a different project, but maybe this is a contrived example, but we could replace that deploy database step with our new step template of deploy OctoFX database. And it's going to have, and then you could come in and configure, oh, I was thinking the website databases don't have ports. Okay, change your connection string, something like that, something that makes more sense. So that's how you would create a step template, and then you could reuse it across multiple projects. Good question.
okay. Could you cover tenants very, very high level? We've got a few people asking about tenants.
Right. So tenants at a very high level is a way to deploy multiple versions of your application to tenants. And tenants is an overloaded term by design because it can mean a variety of things. It could be I have a SaaS product and I'm deploying to multiple customers. And I want them to be on different versions of my application with different configurations and maybe even different infrastructure. These are my SaaS customers that are on shared hosted, so they're all going to one deployment target. These are my SaaS customers that have dedicated hosting, so I give them each individual targets. Octopus lets you set up tenants as a way to take your application and kind of add another dimension into this overview. So now we have a release number of 1. Here you would see your customer list. So you would say, oh, I want to deploy version 1 to development for customer number 1 or customer number 2. Customer is one use case. You can also use it to model different regions within the same environment. So if you have different production data centers, that could be modeled as tenants. You have I'm in Dallas, so you could have a Texas or a Dallas data center tenant that would have different configuration. And you could have you're in Scotland, so you could have like a Scotland or UK data center as a tenant. I think that's a pretty high overview without actually going in and configuring it, which I think would probably eat up the rest of our time. But we can share. I think we have some blog posts and we have some videos on that we can share in the Slack channel to follow up. Is that a good enough of a high level tenant overview?
Yeah, I think you've answered that. There are some more questions, but we're now getting into more advanced topics. With the more advanced topics, guys, what would be great is if you do want to jump into the Slack channel, please post them. Ryan and I will start working through along with a few other people. But I think that's really it for questions. But there are quite a few questions about the session. Just to put everybody at ease, this is being recorded just now, and everything will be emailed within the next 24 to 48 hours. with a full list and all of the resources that Ryan has pulled together for this. But yeah, just wanted to be upfront about that. And yeah, we will also share all resources. So that's octopus.com docs. There'll be some videos. Certainly there's some Octopus samples that we've also got there. And everything will be sent across. And what we're also doing is we are repeating this at the end of June. So by all means, please do let people, and obviously I wouldn't recommend attending it again. It will be a fairly similar presentation. But from here, certainly, and with that, we'll share it with other members in your team or friends, etc. But yeah, that's it really. We'll send that out. And Ryan, thank you very much for taking the time.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks, Derek, for moderating. I want to add in just real quick. So we will be doing this kind of monthly at the end of the month. I think we're going to try and swap out the examples. So you may see a different application next time that somebody else will be presenting. But I'd also like to say in the Slack channel, if you have those advanced questions, tell us what you'd like to see as maybe an advanced topic webinar. If you want to see a full webinar on tenants, for example, and that's something we can put together for the future.